I had to take a leak.
Sherry, for some reason you're breaking up.
Yeah. In here.
I don't.
Yeah.
Sherry, we didn't hear a word. We didn't hear a word you said. So I'm not sure if there's an audio problem on your end or not.
Okay, so what options?
Right now, you're coming clear right now.
Okay. So you didn't hear anything at all?
No.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay. Start over. Take two.
Yes.
Take two.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Special Love Parent Getaway Weekend. But we haven't gotten away. We're safe in our homes. My name is Sherry Fisher. I came to Special Love in 1996 when my daughter Julia was diagnosed with Wilms tumor. I'm also the parent of two sons who came up through the BRASS program.
You're breaking up again. There must be something wrong with your internet. Okay. Sherry. Oh, technology.
No.
I think Andy's binging Netflix again.
Yeah. Sherry, you're just continuing to break up. So if you're okay, I'm going to go ahead and just intro Dr. Lushniak. Okay. All right. So we welcome everyone. What Sherry was trying to say is happy that everybody is safe at home and still being able to get together this morning. We are quite fortunate to have Rear Admiral Boris Lushniak retired with us this morning. He was the acting Surgeon General and Deputy Surgeon General before becoming the Dean of the Public Health School at Maryland University. Maryland, right? Yeah. So I have been very fortunate to work with him several times and hear him speak. And so I think you were in for a real treat this morning. So I am going to turn it over to Boris.
Great. Thank you so much, Jan. And thank you so much, Sherry. It's really a pleasure to be here. You know, on a Saturday morning, you know, Jan and I sort of go back many years to, you know, previous endeavors with dialogues in cancer and previous work on skin cancer prevention, which are two areas that I've been sort of involved with, is the area of prevention and the area of skin cancer in particular. But today, we had discussed this. I still remember the invite coming in pre-COVID. And it's sort of weird, isn't it, for us to consider that there was actually a pre-COVID time, right? And that's going to be part of our theme today. It's the whole idea of our own personal resilience, and our own sort of striving towards health and wellness in the midst of all this. So, I'm not an oncologist. I'm not going to be talking cancer, right? I'm a preventive medicine, public health person. And today's emphasis, right, for this parents get together, which is different than initially set up, right? We were supposed to be, I think, Jen, in Tyson's, right? There was going to be a get together. We were going to look at each other in the eye. And I was going to be doing my usual walking through the aisles and reaching out and talking with you about my theme. So we're resilient, right? The weekend still goes on. It's modified. It's different than it was supposed to have been. And yet the good thing is what? Is we're together, right? And the good thing is that this allows us perhaps a little different way of reacting and interacting. So my theme today, and I'm going to try to put my slides on, and I really do want ultimately for this to be a conversation. So I'm going to get through some of my theme, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers at the end of all this. But let me see whether I can get this on. So is it on right now? Can you see the slides? Okay.
It's on.
So as already mentioned, this is Special Love Incorporated. And this is the Parents Weekend. And what a great organization that you're a part of. What a great name for an organization. As mentioned, my name is Boris Lushniak. I'm currently the Dean and Professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland, and formerly spent 28 years in the U.S. government, right? All those years, 27 years in uniform, wearing the uniform of the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps. 16 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 6 years at the Food and Drug Administration, and then my final 5 years prior to retiring from the service in the Office of the Surgeon General, where I was honored and humbled to serve as the Deputy U.S. Surgeon General and for about a year and a half as the Acting U.S. Surgeon General. And in that pathway, what became very apparent to me is this idea of where we stand regarding our own personal health and our family's health, right? And I know that through this organization, Special Love, which is a group of individuals coming together, not under the best of circumstances, right? The diagnosis of a family, of a loved one, of a child with cancer is undoubtedly a difficult process to go through. And it's the healing that goes on, it's the worry that goes on, it's the interacting that goes on that's very critical for us in the midst of all this. I always put out this slide basically saying I'm here as an individual, right? I'm not talking from an industry perspective. I don't have commercial supporters. From a medical aspect, I'm not going into drugs or devices that are off-label. I now technically work for the state of Maryland as the dean and professor at a state-based school. From 88 to 2016, I was part of the U.S. government, but I speak only for myself today. So the views expressed in this presentation are those of the author and do not reflect the policy or position of the state of Maryland. Let's begin this theme, right? If we're talking about, first of all, us as individuals, and we talk about health of us in times of stress, and whether that stress deals with a loved one, a child with cancer, perhaps the loss of a child with cancer, perhaps the uncertainty of life in general, right? We're right now in a very stressful period on top of everything else that you as individuals may be going through, right? The COVID situation, the social ramifications, even the election. There's so much tumultuous concepts going on in our lives right now. And what we strive for is to be healthy, right? And I want to reemphasize this idea or emphasize this idea that the definition of health as set up by the World Health Organization is incredible to me. These are, over my years of being a public health practitioner, I have a few things that I've printed out and that always are on my office walls. And this is one of those. This reminds me of what we're trying to do, whether it's for our children, whether it's for us, whether it's for elderly parents, whether it's for other loved ones around us. It is aspirational, right? Because the definition of health starts off by saying it's a state of complete. And I'm going to stop there first because it deals with the idea that it's not partial. It's not that we're halfway there. the aspirational aspect is it's complete. And then complete what? And there it's broken down into three major buckets, right? It's complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Right? Concentrate on those words: complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And what we're trying to do here in the midst of all this is, how do we strive in the midst of all the stressors out there to be healthier individuals? What are we in control of? What are we not in control of? Just as importantly, when we talk about health and disease, we talk about, sort of all the different factors that play a role in health and disease. There's our social environment, as mentioned in that definition, our physical environment, the stuff around us. There's our genetic predisposition, our internal environment. Built into that are our individual responses, our behavior, our biology. That plays a role in terms of our health and our functioning, whether we have disease or not. It's interplaying with healthcare. Do we have access or not? And at what level of quality? That plays a role with our well-being and prosperity. But in reality, right, in terms of the determinants of health and disease, where and how we live, where we learn, where we work, and where we play a key role in terms of that. The other definition, and we're going to soon be beyond the definitions, is as a public health person, how do I define public health, right? A doctor, and I'm trained as a physician. So my background is I'm a physician, an MD, trained in family medicine initially, then trained further in preventive medicine, specifically occupational medicine, and then trained ultimately in dermatology. So multifaceted in terms of my background. And as a physician, when I did clinical care, it's very much what we go through on a regular basis, right? We go into a doctor, and that relationship is between a doctor and the patient, perhaps the patient's families, their loved ones, but there's an interaction that goes on. And it's more or less on a personal level. What happens in the world of public health is the patient now is the population, right? So that's a major shift. And when we talk about the aspects of public health, it's clearly defined over now 100 years ago. A guy named C.A. Winslow was a microbiologist, one of the initial leaders of public health in the United States, talked about public health being a science and an art. And then, as I tell my students, it's about the 3 Ps. It's about preventing disease. It's about prolonging a high quality of life and promoting health and wellness. But the second part of this definition is just as important, right? It's not just in a doctor-patient relationship, right, where it's a medical care system interacting. Here, because we're dealing with the population, the second part of this definition is just as critical. We talk about the fact that it takes a village to really do public health. It's the organized efforts and informed choices of society. It's about everybody. Organizations, both public and private, communities and individuals. So we take this from an aspect of health being defined and now public health being defined. I also want to bring into this scheme, and I recently gave a talk for our agriculture school, our College of Agriculture. And what's agriculture have to do with health? And I wanted to sort of bring this to our discussion here today, the concept of One Health, right? Which is, in essence, it's a collaborative approach, right? Multi-sectors. It goes against or across all disciplines. It works at all levels, and it really talks about the interconnection of our world and that health. The One Health concept now, it's the interconnectedness, not just of human health, but it's the interconnectedness between human health and, yes, animal health, plant health, and planetary health, the shared environment. And so what we're now having, and this movement, I would say, has really sort of taken sort of extra traction in the last 10 years or so, is the interconnectedness of how we look at what's happening in the world in general. And yes, this may apply to our current situation with COVID, right? Which is, in the world, we know human populations are growing and expanding into new areas. There's closer contact with wild and domestic animals. There's changes in our climate and land use, disruptions in environmental conditions, increased movement of people, animals, animal products. And so there's more of an option, right? Or opportunity, not an option for diseases to cross over, right? And that now presents various issues. It's the animal-based diseases that we sometimes worry about in this health approach, right? It's that whole environmental aspect. And guess what? COVID-19 came from an animal population. It's still to be determined where it came from, perhaps through bats, an animal called a pangolin. Did it come from the markets in China? All that is to be determined. But much like other diseases, we now, in this sort of paradigm of health that we're discussing, have to get a sense it's not just about our own human health. It's about the interconnectedness with the rest of the inhabitants of this planet. And issues that come up under this One Health include the diseases that are out there, resistance to antibiotics, food safety, food security, the vector-borne diseases, right? Mosquitoes and what they're doing, environmental contamination, and yes, how this interplays with chronic diseases, with with mental health, with injuries and occupational health. So the concept of One Health really is this concept of, yes, the doctors, the nurses, the public health people now interact with the veterinarians, with the ag worker, with the paraprofessionals, and interact now with the environmental health people, right? If we look at health being all part of this. And when we look at the threats, right, with the World Health Organization, this is last year's list. This year's list is probably going to be changed because of what we're going through with COVID-19. These are part of the issues that we have to think. And it's not, I don't want you to walk away saying, oh my God, this is doom and gloom. These are, in my view, challenges, but one that we need to sort of play a role in, right? Air pollution, climate change, non-communicable diseases, right? The chronic diseases, people who are in fragile and vulnerable settings, right? I mentioned antibiotic resistance, weak primary care, vaccine hesitancy, now playing a role yet again, not only with influenza vaccines, but soon to be the new COVID vaccines that will be out there. Dengue, HIV, influenza pandemic, and Ebola and other threats, right? These are things that are out there. Putting burdens on our concept of health. So again, there's things we can control and there's things that are out of our control. But I think having awareness of this One Health leads us down a certain pathway, because the things that we can control in terms of our own resilience and health is really sort of goes back to this cartoon, right? Patients sitting there saying, give it to me straight, doc. How long do I have to ignore your advice before I have to take your advice? Because there are things that you as parents, you as individuals in that community need to make choices about. And when we talk about health care in this country, it's an incredible resource-dependent entity of healthcare, right? $3.6 trillion spent annually in the United States on healthcare. And yet some of the problems, some people estimate anywhere between 60 and 80%, right, are due to some of our own innate behaviors and lifestyle choices, right? So how do we control our own health? And here's aspects of this. I don't want you to spend too much time reading this, but look at the left side of it, right? Which is, in essence, we have some control over this, right? Alcohol, blood pressure. Do we take our blood pressure? Do we react to it? Body weight, cholesterol, other medical conditions, right? Blood parameters associated perhaps with our diet, illness days, life satisfaction. What's our mental health in the midst of all this? Perception of health. How do we feel? What's our physical activity? Certainly the smoking issue, which I'll talk about briefly because the Surgeon General's office has been involved in that. And that's a societal success story that I want to emphasize. And the issue of stress. How are we dealing with stress in our environment? And what we know is, as individuals with those controlling factors, if we look at the aspects of when we eat better, when we don't smoke, when we increase our activity and we limit alcohol intake, what we know is these things, many of which are dependent on my own choices, right? As an adult, as a parent, as a member of a family, I can influence others around me. But we know those decision points can, in fact, lead towards healthier scenarios, right? Reduction of diseases, right, in the midst of all this. Let's briefly talk about the issue of a biggie, right? We always talk about this idea of, oh, just go out and exercise more, right? Do it, right? Just do it. Well, it's not as easy as me talking about it, but I also want you to realize that exercise is an incredible agent, right? I love this quote because we sometimes live in a society of what? We live in a society that tells us, here's a prescription, right? Take this pill, it'll make you feel better. And this quote sort of puts into that realm, right? If we had a pill that conferred all the proven health benefits of exercise, people like me, physicians, would prescribe it to every patient, right? Our healthcare system would find a way to make sure that it was paid for because of its positive attributes, and every patient would have access to this wonder drug, right? If we had a pill that did it all, we'd all want it. Reality is we don't have a pill that does it all. And reality is the future doesn't show us that it's going to be that easy. But it also shows us the attributes of things like movement. And I think, and I was really sort of struck by this when I was in the Surgeon General's office, is sometimes people view the idea of exercise of being only done in a certain way. We entered an age in our society where everything is ultra, right? It's unless you're an ultra marathoner, it's not even the marathon that's good enough anymore. It's the ultras, right? Oh, you have to be an extreme person. The reality is that, when you look at movement, it's not about having the $100 pair of special shoes. It's not about the gym memberships, right? It's the idea of something as simple as walking. Right? When I left the Surgeon General's office and the next Surgeon General took over, he continued a project there that talked about what? Talked about walking and walkable communities as a key feature of health of our communities. Remember, we talked about public health. It's about the population. When we bring it down to the individual level, right? The idea of exercise and how we throw that into our own personal decision-making has incredible ramifications, right? We can talk about the cardiovascular effects of even taking that walk, right? Control of blood pressure, makes us breathe better, gets us out there. But also the mental health aspects of this, the idea of getting out, right? There's actually a movement out there now called Nature RX, Nature Prescription. And some physicians are involved in this, which basically says is they write you a prescription saying, hey, spend 30 minutes, every other day walking in the woods. Find some woods, right? If you're blessed with woods near your home, do it. And the idea of that proven that brings down stress levels is a key feature, right? These are behavior things that help us with that resilience, are not the easiest. I'll be the first to admit it, right? Some days I just don't feel like going somewhere, right? Do I sometimes force myself? Yeah. Do I always enjoy it when it's done? Without a doubt. We've had incredible successes in public health, right, over the years. This is a list that's put out in every, they do it, I think, now every 10 years, but this was for the whole century, for the whole 20th century, of talking about the public health achievements. So when we look at all this, we talk about, in the 1900s, here's what we achieved. And you have to realize, you go back to the year 1900, we didn't know much, right? Science and medical science was just evolving, right? We talk about vaccination, motor vehicle safety, safer workplaces, control of infectious diseases, decline in deaths from heart disease, safer, healthier foods, healthier mothers and babies, family planning, fluoridation, and recognition of tobacco as a health hazard, right? These were major components of this population health, right, aspect. And I want to bring this up as an example. Excuse me. I won't spend too much time on this, but this is a key component of what my life was like in the Surgeon General's office. We were at that time preparing the 50th anniversary report on smoking and health. And I'll talk about that briefly. But we come from an age of this, right? You look at these are real advertisements, right? This is a time that, that existed in our society. You can look these up in archival, scenarios where it's almost, you flabbergasting to look at these, right? To say that, well, this is it. Here's a doctor saying this. More doctors smoke this brand than any other, right? That, it's this cigarette brand is good. Look how happy that doctor is holding it because it's less irritating, right? This is 60, 70 years ago. It's not in the 1800s, folks. This is in the 1900s, right, where we had this philosophy. And the reason I bring this up is, can we as a society change? I talk about the issue of exercise and saying, well, do it as an individual. But we actually change the society when it comes to this, right? And this is the success story, right? So I talked about the whole beforehand of, where the beard came from, right? So I enjoy nature. I like heading out into the mountains. I dabbled in mountaineering. And And for the longest time, I thought I'd be someday on the top of Mount Everest. That aspiration, I've decided, isn't worth it anymore. But I've been to the Everest region twice. I've been out there looking and seeing and all. And I'm going to bring you back to a different era, right? And that era was 1963. Now, mind you, the first Surgeon General's report on smoking came out in 1964. So this is an expedition that's heading out, the first ever American expedition, heading out to climb this mountain, right? And it's the highest mountain on this planet. To that point in time, right, there were only 3 or 4 different expeditions that made it to the top. 1953, trivia question, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay made it to the top. They were a British expedition. The Swiss had made it. The Chinese claimed they made it. I'm not sure whether people believe them or not. And now USA, we're heading to the mountain. Who were the 3 major sponsors of this expedition? Number 1 was the National Geographic Society, right? I mean, they wanted, right, they're sending an expedition. This is like sending people to the moon in that era to some extent, right? Certainly the team was sent out as if it was going to the Olympics, right? This is the red, white, and blue on the highest mountain. This was a different era, right? Nowadays, you have hundreds of people making it to the top. This was a different era. And what we had here was National Geographic Society wants their flag on top of the mountain. They want the photo op, and they want the article. Number 2, major sponsor, Eddie Bauer Corporation. Right? They came up with this idea of down and making people warm and all that. So that makes sense. Number 3 major sponsor, American Tobacco Corporation, right? A conglomerate of tobacco. And in fact, one of my most bizarre quotes from that era was James Ullman, who's a member of that expedition, talks about that the smokers of the expedition were horrified to discover that instead of the expected 60,000 cigarettes, there were only 6,000. Everyone knows you can't climb a mountain on that little nicotine, right? It's almost bizarre as seeing those photographs of the advertisements with doctors, to think that this was not that long ago, right? I'm now 61. I was 4 years old, right? So this is now 57 years ago where somebody had this, right? And if you don't believe we can change society, think back. This is a half a century ago, little longer than that. And yet we look at this statement, we look at the advertisements of saying, oh my God, were those people on a different planet? Right? It changed, right, because of a Surgeon General. Surgeon General Luther Terry, 1964, came up with this report. It identified smoking as a cause of lung cancer in men. That's what the data showed, but also had this determination that it's a health hazard of sufficient importance in the United States. Okay, feds, what are you going to do about it? Public health, what are you going to do about it? And I think sort of downplays what was ultimately done. It was basically, it warrants appropriate remedial action, right? A subtle sort of way of saying we're beginning to change the world. And maybe back then nobody realized it. 50 years later, right, we're at Luther Terry's grave. That's me in uniform. Former Surgeon General Satcher is there, members of the Luther Terry family. This is at Arlington National Cemetery, laying a wreath. And the wreath wasn't just to a single person, it was to a movement. And the reason I bring it up here today is that movements like this occasionally are successful to change humanity, right? We in essence move from the advertisements on the right-hand side of the screen to this idea of, we're moving against this, right? We came up with the 50th anniversary report that talked about, right, the idea that there's historical and trend information over 50 years. There's been successes. There's been failures as well. There's new findings on health effects of smoking. There's a call to action. How can we end the continuing tobacco use epidemic? Enough is enough, right, at some stage. And this is sometimes what it takes with movements like this and other movements, right? Fighting cancer as a movement. Enough is enough. How do we put our hearts and souls into something that ultimately affects not just us as individuals and our families, but all of the population? When we look at the successes, right, what we realized when it came to smoking, we still have people dying every year. 480,000 annual deaths, 20 million premature deaths since the first report was issued. This is at the 50th anniversary mark. It still remains the largest single cause of preventable disease and death. But now the optimists, it saved 8 million lives since 1964 because of the movement, right? The economic burden still exists, but the reality is we're making some headway. We also know that there's an industry to fight here, right? The tobacco epidemic was initiated and sustained by aggressive tactics of the tobacco industry, right? That spends a lot of dollars. Can you fight big corporations? The answer is yes. They're still out there. They're still in existence. It isn't banned, but a movement has really made major repercussions on this. And what we know is a movement, for example, that's in this case led by a Surgeon General's office, right, that provides the critical scientific information for public health action, ultimately does have its effects. And what do we know? 64, we had 42% of our society were smokers, right? We then began phasing out ads on TV and radio, right? By 1970, 37% are smokers. We have more bans on ads. The last cigarette ad runs on the Tonight Show in 71. We start talking about secondhand smoke. We then move on to restrictions, right? We don't give it to the troops anymore. We're down to 33%. We start putting taxes on these products. We're down to 26%. We then start movements saying that you shouldn't be able to smoke on the board airplanes or in restaurants, right? EPA classifies secondhand smoke as a carcinogen. White House goes smoke-free, right? Lawsuits are being filed, right? Smoke-free bars and restaurant laws, tobacco master settlement agreements. I'm running through a timeline that ultimately shows you that in the midst of this movement, right, where a society says something bad is going on that affects the public's health, people still to this day have a decision to make whether they utilize that contraption of a cigarette or e-cigarettes for that matter. But the reality is that we've made incredible movement, right? 23% smokers, started at 42%, 18% smokers by 2014. The reality is that here is a sense that when we put our minds to it, when we talk about population health and health in general, we can make major changes in our lives and in the lives of our population. I want to finish up talking about this concept of a national prevention strategy. How do we work towards getting our own personal health in line, right? And the vision of this strategy is how do we improve the health and quality of life? We start at my level, the individual, your individual level, the people around you sitting next to you on this call, the families. How do we improve the health and quality of our communities? How do we move from a focus on sickness and disease to one also that's based on prevention and wellness? And here, much like that definition of public health, it takes a village, right? Partners include the feds, the states, tribal, local, territorial, businesses and employers, healthcare systems, educational systems, community and faith-based organizations, individuals and families, having all these roles, everything from policy to being consumers, to being data collectors, to being healthcare people, communicators, and educators. The center of this is critical, right, of this little chart. It's basically the goal is to increase the number of Americans who are healthy, using that World Health Organization definition of health at every stage of life, right? It empowers us as people, eliminate health disparities, provides preventive services in our communities, and health and safety community environments. And the key features of these priorities, these are things that are handleable, right? We still have a tobacco issue. We still need to fight, right? Drug abuse, excessive alcohol use, healthy eating, active living. We talked about exercise, injury and violence-free living, reproductive and sexual health, and mental and emotional well-being. If you pick out all these things, they actually play a key role on mortality of our society. Now, as I finish up this brief conversation, we open up to questions and discussions about the issue of health and our own resilience. When we look at population health and how it's mostly affected, notice that the bottom of this pyramid has the largest impact. That's the socioeconomic factors. Is poverty a public health issue? Yes, it is. Is unemployment, underemployment a public health issue? Yes, it is. How do we change the context, right, to make the individual's default decisions, right? We talk about the idea of smoke-free places, right? That's not a decision you make as an individual. That's society making a decision. Preventive, protective interventions are next up, right? The issue of immunizations. Are we taking advantage of those preventive measures, right? Clinical interventions, the treatments, and then finally counseling and education have the smallest impact, but still have an impact on who we do or what we do in terms of health. Now we have COVID come aboard, right? This is a beautiful looking picture, right? Oh my God, look at the colors, look at that. And this is a killer now, right? This is something that none of us wanted. We didn't expect it happening now. And we're back into this idea of how do we as individuals deal with the resilience, our resilience factor in health, right? I'm going to repeat what you've heard all along, but I need as a public health person to remind you, right? We need to control COVID in our communities. The community aspect is testing individuals, tracing, isolating, and quarantining where necessary. The 3 W's, wear a mask, wash your hands, watch your distance from others. There's going to be a vaccination program coming up in the next half year, without a doubt. That'll be throughout the whole United States. Vaccine hesitancy, people who say, I'm not interested in the vaccine, is now at 50%. That is not a sign of success of a vaccination program. We're going to have to deal with that. The logistics of a program, and obviously in the midst of this recent election, the transition of COVID national leadership, right? The reality is that this plays a role in terms of our own psyche, right? And no matter where you stand politically, I'm not here to talk about partisan politics. The reality is that as a public health person, the vaccine will be a game changer, but doesn't stop us from doing these other things. So when it comes to your own personal health, there's one thing talking to you about healthy eating and exercising and clearing your mind. There's another aspect that in the midst of this crisis, take all this quite seriously, right? In terms of making sure that in the acute stage, you are protecting yourself from this disease. I'm going to finish up this presentation with sort of a vision, if you will. And it's a vision for, for special love. It's a vision for perhaps you as an individual who's looking at something. Maybe it's dealing with the treatments your child may be going through. Maybe it's dealing with the loss of a child, right? And I'm going to sort of reflect on my last major deployment as an officer in the public health service. And this was home for about 3, nearly 4 months, right? This was something called the Monrovia Medical Unit, outside of about an hour's drive from Monrovia, the capital of Liberia. And this was in the midst of the Ebola response. This was home, right, for me. And it's sort of an interesting setup because you have the patient care area that's on the upper part. It's the living area down below. There's a separation. But a key feature in this whole area was this, right? We spent a lot of time while working there looking at this. And what is this? This is an 8-foot-tall chain link fence, topped off in barbed wire, as you see, covered in tarpaulin. And there was a purpose for this. Part of it was we had patients there that we were treating with Ebola. It was privacy. There was open air components to their treatment area. It was for force protection. I had officers who were working there, right? We didn't want to have that sense not only of privacy, but security. So there was a reason for this. But at the same time, as you can imagine, this was somewhat claustrophobic, right? As you're working even in that area, you kept looking at this. Now, one evening, I was sort of the commanding officer, a 2-star admiral, right, on site there, not running the hospital day to day, but running the operation. And one evening, I spent time with the night shift, right? And the night shift was sort of common with many other night shifts that exist in healthcare scenarios. They enjoyed working with each other. There was a benefit working nights, right? And when you were stationed there, you worked on nights during the whole time period, right? And it was cooler in the hot African sort of environment. Patients still had to be cared for. You had to do what was called the dives. You would go in and, with the moon suits and all that to take care of the Ebola patients. But they had a ritual. Every midnight, they would gather together before going in for one of their first patient visits or patient dives. And they would flip pancakes, right? They had a little kitchen area and they would have a team meeting. And I went to one of these team meetings and tell them what? Tell them, one, I'm proud of you. Second thing, much like you use the word love and special love, that I love them for what they're doing, right? For their service, for their country, for the Liberian patients we're taking care of, for others. And as I left and was heading to my tent that evening, I run into 4 officers, younger officers, and they're building something. And I turned to them, I go, guys, what are you building? They gave me a response, which they shouldn't have, which is, we can't tell you, sir. They used to call me sir back then. And I'm like, what do you mean you can't tell me? I wasn't into hassling them, but I said, just be careful. There's power tools, there's things going on. I go, just don't hurt yourself. They go, but no, if this works, we'll show you in the morning. Sure enough, 6, 7 hours later, I'm leaving my tent, and I'm heading to the showers, and I ran into those same 4 officers. and this is what they showed me, right? This is what they built. And, you know, you can see it's kind of a lifeguard's tower, right? And I'm thinking to myself, what? You know, why did you build this? And they said, you know, sir, why don't you climb to the top? I'm sort of looking at this contraption. I'm not that foolish. I'm not certainly an adventurer, but I have a younger, you know, aide de camp, a young lieutenant. So I send him up first to make sure it's sturdy, and then I follow, right? Leadership. And then we're up there, right? And as we sat, and what they said to me was, as you sit down, shut your eyes and then open them. So we got up there, and all of a sudden we had smiles over our face. Why? Because we can see stuff we didn't see before, right? We can see Africa from up there. We can see the village that we're serving. We can see the road that heads to the laboratory that's nearby us. And oftentimes I thought to myself, this someday will be a funny story. And then I actually sort of thought more about it. I slept on it and said, this is metaphor for sometimes what we're involved with in our lives. Because a lot of times is how much time do we spend focusing and felt entrapped by goals, by aspirations, by what we want to do, by sort of life around us, by metaphorically looking at an 8-foot-tall chain link fence, topped off in barbed wire, covered with tarpaulin. And sometimes what you need is to figure out a way to lift ourselves up so we actually see the horizon, that we see something beyond those initial barricades in front of us. And I'll submit to you, a meeting like this, I'll submit to you an organization like Special Love is metaphorically that lifeguard's nest, right? It allows us to seek aspirations. It allows us to fill in gaps in public health, right? I need to see the big picture. Notice when it came to tobacco, my example, I'm not perseverating, but it's a key example of how we change the world. The success story in the 20th century was recognition of tobacco. Can we talk about elimination? Can we talk about elimination of childhood cancers as an aspiration? It's not going to happen if we look at that chain link fence and the tarp in front of us. It's only going to happen if we look beyond that. And so that's my final message, is that in the midst of this resilience, in the midst of the decisions of how we're dealing with all these stressors, how are we
You muted yourself.
am I back?
Yeah, you're back. I unmuted
Great.
you.
So anyhow, it was a perfect way to finish because that guy's talked too much already is what you're saying. Anyhow, thank you for your attention here today. Thank you for being who you are. And thank you for, you know, for what you bring to the world, right? Which is, you know, we understand, you know, this isn't the group that you wanted to join, right? It's much like it's not, you know, none of us chose to have COVID, none of just, but under these circumstances, Special Love is filled with special love. So thank you so much for having me on here today. And if you have any questions about any of these concepts, everything from COVID to anything, let's make it a discussion now. So Jan, back to you.
Well, Boris, thank you as always. Wonderful talk, great motivation for us. I have been texting with Sherry back and forth, who is rebooting her router and that to try and rejoin us. But in the meantime, she's wedding dress shopping. So if there are questions for Boris, I've unmuted everybody, so please remain quiet unless you have a question, because I get a lot of background noise. Yeah, I unmuted everybody. I could ask a question. So if anyone has any questions for Dr. Lushniak, please speak up. If I continue to get a lot of noise, I'll have to mute and then ask people to raise their hand.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anyone questions? I mean, from basic health to
Como usted desee, si usted quiere que la llame más tarde o como. Ok. Ajá.
no questions. I know the Tomoffs have questions. They always have questions.
I have a question, if I could.
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks for a great presentation. Really, just terrific. You talked about some of the major advances over the last 20 to 50 years in terms of awareness of smoking, dangers, new thoughts and concepts about exercise, what constitutes exercise. What do you see in, say, the next 10 or 20 years is the next thing, big thing with regard to public health that people should be talking about and thinking about, but hasn't hit the radar screen in the same way that 50 years ago, smoking awareness was not where it is now, exercise awareness was not where it is now. What do you see in the next decade or two, something that we'll be talking about or should be talking about more, but just hasn't hit public consciousness yet? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's why I was finished with that one slide, which is right now we're building a list for 2099, right? Sometime in 2099, I'll be long gone, but the reality is CDC is going to come up with a list that says, here's the 10 major accomplishments. And, and your question basically is what are we heading for, right? So let's bring up something that's near and dear to all of you, right? For special love, right? And that's the idea is that we have to get this sense of a better hold on the idea, not only of prevention, right? There's a preventive aspect to cancers in general, but childhood cancer is not something that's preventable, right? I mean, this is not something that's a lifestyle choice. Oh, I chose to smoke or I didn't. I did. The reality is that we have to get better in terms of the therapeutics and the elimination of cancer in this century, right? And this has been discussed in the past. When I was at FDA, Dr. von Eschenbach was formerly director of National Cancer Institute, and almost, he came out and said, we're going to eliminate cancer. And everybody said, oh, come on, really? This is aspirational. Well, guess what, folks? This century is about aspirations. And so the reality is that I view several things, one of which is on the therapeutic front is the whole idea of cancer and its elimination in our society. How are we going to do this? It's going to take a lot of work. Are we going to do this one by one? Yeah, we're going to do this one by one. The idea of even, let's say in the realm of melanoma, as a dermatologist, right? The idea of vaccine elimination of cancer, right? How are we going to, I think the big factor of this century is going to be us understanding our immune system much better, right? And it's not, the reality is, and many of you have lived through this, right? The way we treat cancers right now is through toxins, right? We try to kill something and try to make sure that normal cells stay as normal as possible. The reality is that we, even in the midst of COVID-19, look at the incredible progress, right? People say, oh, this is a completely messed up, reaction to COVID-19. I'm not a fan of how the public health system has reacted. I'm not a fan of how it's been led, et cetera, et cetera. That's a sideline. But do you realize that if you recall, right, think back what you were doing on New Year's Eve, 2019 going into 2020, right? All of us have that as a point in time because we kind of can remember, right? Were we heading out to dinner? Were we going to spend it at home? That's a special day. Why is that day important? That's the day, December 31st, 2019, that the World Health Organization office in China was informed of an outbreak of pneumonia in about 40 people due to an unknown cause, right? It seems like it's a decade ago. It's only 11 and a half months ago. And oh my God, the fact that in 11 and a half months, we have 2 vaccines here in the United States and many more throughout the world that may be part of the answer. This is what needs the focus that needs to be put on the immune system in general. How do I get the immune system better understood so that I can figure out a way that immune system not only fights COVID-19, but fights HIV, it fights cancers of all kinds, right? We're on the cusp of incredible advancements. And I would submit to you that for that great question is that's where we're going to make incredible progress. And to some extent, it falls into the realm of something called personalized medicine, right? What works for one person doesn't work for another. Right now, we're so generic. It's almost like where we want to go is so advanced. And what we're doing right now is so 18th century, right? We're giving everybody the same thing with the assumption it's going to. No. Once you get into that immune system understanding, it's going to be very individualized for us to understand that. And I think that's the excitement that I have.
First, I'm going to jump in with the question: how do you think we're ready, or do you think we're ready as a country to deliver this vaccine to the groups needed first and down the chain?
Well, first of all, I mean, let's sort of put us back where we're at right now, right? So, incredible advancement. So, two negatives to this. One is, guess what? This is a brand new vaccine. It's called a messenger RNA vaccine. We've never, ever used this technology before to make a vaccine. Okay. It seems to be working well, right? Both trials, right? The Pfizer trial and the Moderna trials are, 30 to 40,000 people, right? So this is real stuff. It's not being given just in a laboratory. These are people out there in our communities, right? And it seems to be working with at least 2-3 months in a very limited side effect. So the reality is that, one, just be aware, right? This is all temporary information, right? As we increase the number of people who are getting to this, data still needs to be coming in. Is it still helping, and is it doing no harm? So that's part of the challenges in front of us. And then to your point is, how are we ever going to get 330 million people immunized in this country, right? This is an incredible endeavor, right? In the best of years, right? We do this every year with influenza vaccine. So who here has gotten their flu shot? I hope everybody raised their hands. If you haven't, then please do. That's the Public Health Service announcement. But the flu vaccine in a good year will get 40% of our population actually getting it. So we have a system, right? 40%. Yes, it's done over longer periods of time, but the reality is we already kind of have an infrastructure, right? I went to a grocery store pharmacy to get my influenza vaccine, right? So this doesn't have to be, if the logistics work out, it can be decentralized as much as possible. That's part of the key. Now, of course, the parameters here are the Pfizer vaccine needs to be kept very, very cold, right? Minus 90 degrees, right? And so now you're talking about technology, right? How do I get those cold chambers out there into the community? The Moderna vaccine is still cold, but it's refrigerator cold. So, I think it's doable. The reality is that it's not going to happen overnight. And many of us are going to be waiting a long time. First of all, we have to be convinced that we want to take this vaccine, right? I mentioned the hesitancy. I worked for FDA for 6 years, and I actually ran the office called the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats, right? The emerging threats is the pandemic. So I worked 10 years ago, the H1N1 pandemic. I was the office that issued the emergency use authorizations for the commissioner. So I know that this is a vibrant regulatory pathway. So what I want to tell people out there is despite all the negative news for CDC and FDA, I'm still a believer in both these institutions. There are incredible scientists there who are dedicated to the public's health. If it comes out under emergency use authorization, is it as good as a fully licensed vaccine? The answer is no. A fully licensed vaccine takes 4 years to 12 years to get out there, right? We have data. It's going to be under emergency use. It's not going to be fully filled in. So it's going to be a risk-benefit assessment for each of us as individuals.
Okay. You have to unmute.
I think I'm on mute. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, Doctor. A number of people on this call who have been involved in childhood cancer advocacy for a number of years. And it felt like we were heading in the right direction with Cancer Moonshot, a lot of activity, but things have changed in the past few years. Some of it is leadership based, some of it is COVID. CDC, I think you will agree, has been disparaged over the past 9 months, and their leadership has been questioned to the nth degree. And cancer, naturally, and all disease issues have kind of been, taken a back seat. You also mentioned in your talk that it takes a leader. The tobacco started to turn around when the Surgeon General really took it on as his project. We've seen the same thing with HIV/AIDS. It takes a lot of leaders. It takes a group who are committed to do this. How do you see us moving forward to accelerate the childhood cancer challenges? And how do we make the changes over the next couple of years?
I think that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. the problem with us as a society, right, in general, we're very reactionary. React to the crisis at hand. And this is not just, I'll put the first blame where the blame really belongs. And you know, again, I'm not passing the buck, but I spent 28 years in the federal service. And what I found is that nothing happens without money. Guess what, folks? Right? It takes money to do everything. It's as, I'll be as blunt as I can on that. And when it comes to decision making regarding the financing in this country, that comes from Congress in conjunction with an administration. And what happens is, and this really just ruffles my feathers all the time, is that we're a very reactionary society. We choose the crisis of the moment. We throw a ton of dollars into it to solve that crisis. And then 2 or 3 years later, we say, oh, crisis is averted. And then we pull that money back and then we wait for the next crisis, right? We saw this with World Trade Center anthrax, right? We saw this with Hurricane Katrina crisis points. We saw this with pandemic of 2009. We saw this with Ebola to some extent, right? Because part of it is from a political aspect, people want to say is, oh, we solved the problem. And yet the issue is, where do we fail then? We fail with this idea of the non-communicable, non-crisis scenarios, right? That always then say, well, we're going to pull off from that pot of money and get it here. I think, again, I always tell my students at the School of Public Health, first of all, in public health, we have to be optimists, right? Pessimists, because there's so many challenges ahead of us, pessimists wash out early in their careers, right? From an optimist perspective, I think the pathway ahead is moonshot 2, right? You have to be able to put it back into the sense is that whether it becomes not just moonshot or Mars shot as a metaphor, right? We're shooting for something even further than we did before. We didn't achieve what we wanted to the first time around. But guess what? The unfortunate aspect is right now, the way we're handling it, childhood cancer is not going away, nor is adult cancer. Those two things are a given. So when are you going to be able to sort of make decisions at a national level saying those are chronic conditions, yes, right, that disrupt lives prematurely, that disrupt our families and our communities prematurely, and we need to treat those as a crisis that is a longer lasting crisis, but one that can be, under correct leadership and correct funding, pursued, right? That's the only approach. You can't do this. You can't be cyclical on these things. Because if you're cyclical, that means at some point you feel like you're in glory days, right? You probably all felt great during the moonshot. This is it. This is it. And then there's disinterest. Why? Because other things become more politically prudent to follow. This is a challenge. This isn't easy stuff. If this were easy stuff, it would have been solved a while ago. So, but again, I think there are pathways. Put the money into immunotherapies, for example. I mean, I'm not touting immunotherapies. I'm just thinking that that's a open frontier that we've not fully understood yet, right? And that begins a process. So leadership, moonshots 2. Let's see what we can do under that aspect.
Okay. Tom, Terry, Bill.
Boris, thank you for the it's incredible presentation. But you hit and we're talking preventative and how can we control our own destiny? And one of the problems are, in the medical profession, and I'll speak like with my primary care physician, maybe they're so rushed that we're only focused on here's a pill to take care of your problem. Part of that is the personal. If I feel fine, I'm fine. And I don't worry about it until I need someone to fix me. So at the individual level, and you talk about the country and being reactionary, but at the individual level, we're reactionary. And the same thing is with this COVID. We aren't thinking about anyone else. We think about ourselves. I don't need to wear a mask. How do we shift the thinking to be more proactive?
Right, and I think that was part of that national prevention strategy concept that we tried to sort of instill when I was in the Surgeon General's office, right? So how do you take that focus from disease-oriented to prevention-oriented? And again, diseases are always going to be out there. Guess what? As I mentioned, prevention is not the answer for childhood cancer, for something that's near and dear to you as a advocacy group, as a support group. Not dear to you, but it's certainly near to you, right? But on the other hand, it's the whole change of focus. You're absolutely right. When a doctor is trained not necessarily to discuss the prevention aspect, but to write the script because you came in with something and I just want to settle your problem and I don't have the time to discuss prevention, right? That's a major problem. So the question is, does that become then a separation of duties, right? So, I have a daughter who's a first-year medical student right now. My wife is a physician. I'm a physician. We're fans of medicine. I'm not fans of what it's turned into. But, the question is, can either I delineate responsibilities, that is, doctors, you're trained to deal with diseases, right? Let's be honest. 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency program teaches you mostly to treat diseases, right? It's a trade. It's a special trade. But you come in with symptoms. I do testing, I analyze, I auscultate with my stethoscope, and then I come up with a problem like an auto mechanic does and says, here's how we're going to solve it. This whole idea of interacting as a person, which is, do I have the time to say I care about you? So maybe I have to create yet another sort of facet to this, right? The problem is there is no glory in prevention, right? Listen to these words very precisely, because I love to play on words here, right? Which is, when prevention works, nothing happens. When prevention works, nothing happens. And that's a double entendre, right? It means if prevention works, nothing happens. But on the other hand, spiritually, when prevention works, nobody cheers about it, right? If I'm a surgeon and I go in and I, clean out your coronary arteries, I get that satisfaction. You get that satisfaction. You had a problem and I solved it. Oh my God, what a hero. But if I discuss with you getting on antihypertensive, changing your diet and exercising more, and I prevented that, no one walks away feeling, yes, we have fireworks going off, the release of 100 virgin doves into the air, right? We're partying over this. The question is, back to metaphors, how do I metaphorically put that prevention as a first line thing, right? The reality is it's part of what we, Terry, your question is part of it may be in the realm, or I'm not sure if Terry is the husband or the wife there, but anyhow, the reality is that from a cost-effective economic way of doing this, prevention is the right approach, and maybe it's going to be the economic way. If I can prevent that coronary artery disease, right, or if I can prevent that adult cancer, then I'm saving money in the long run, right? And sometimes economics has to play a role in this, but you're absolutely right. We have a system that does not reward for prevention. Therefore, it's not taken seriously, right? And the question is, how do I focus on this? Because that's the answer, right? If I can solve problems early on, it's higher quality of life, right? So let's talk about childhood obesity and overweight, right? That pudgy little kid becomes the overweight teen becomes the obese adult becomes the morbidly obese adult. On that pathway, I've gone down the pathway of what? Cardiovascular disease, of diabetes, of arthritic conditions, a whole litany of problems. If I had stopped it, and that person probably now has to be on a ton of medications, that person is unhappy, right? That person is not a fully capable member of our society, perhaps not being able to work, et cetera, et cetera. If I had intervened in this process, all that would have disappeared, right? Again, aspirational, but you're absolutely right. We got to figure out a way of doing this.
All right. Well, we have time for one quick question. If anybody has one quick question, if you do, you have to unmute. I see everybody.
Let me continue as we wait for one last one. The last thing I wanted to say is, and yet don't think that we can easily pass the buck and say, oh, until medicine figures it out, right, then we're not dealing with it. The concept of the National Prevention Strategy was what? It begins with me, right?
Yep.
If I live that life and I educate myself and I listen, right, I start doing what's good for me. So it becomes initially selfish, but now I turn to my life partner, to my wife, to my husband, to loved ones around me, and I influence them. I now have gone from the individual to the family level. I then begin influencing my community in some fashion. It doesn't have to be all at once. But the question is, how do we introduce prevention? There's a top-down approach that the federal government and medicine and all can do, but also there's a community approach. Remember that definition of public health. It takes a village. And where the two can meet is where we need to go. We have to put more of an effort into it.
Right.
Back to you, Jan.
As you know, we could spend a whole session on just talking how expensive prevention can be. I mean, a low-income family can get a meal at McDonald's much cheaper than they can go in and buy healthy food. And that's what's wrong in our society. So so that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you. I hope that you can join us again when we are in person. Hopefully next year we're in person, but we will see. We're keeping it open. And for those of you who are staying with us, you will have to, so I'm going to end this session, and then you will go back to the SL Parents site and tune in for now Dr. Donna Gregory's presentation on our brass camp. So
Okay, thank
again,
you all.
thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.